Faith Time is our regular conversation on matters of faith, and joining us is Pastor Jeff Copeland with Kingdom Bridges. Good day to you, sir.
Good day, Chad. Good to be here.
All right, let's start with the basics about your organization. What is Kingdom Bridges?
We are a ministry that focuses on indigenous local leaders in church and mission work in Eastern Europe, primarily Moldova and Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And we bridge connections and relationships from America, particularly the Gulf Coast region, where I've been a pastor before I started this ministry for over 30 years, with those ministries to, as we say, see heaven touch earth.
All right, let's talk about the idea of orphanages. It may sound like an antiquated term in the West, but what are some of those cultural differences in Eastern Europe that may leave youth at risk?
It's a culture and climate before the war, which now in the areas we work, Ukraine and Moldova, has changed the whole landscape.
Mm-hmm.
But prior to the war, those were the poorest regions in Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And most people had to leave the countries to find gainful employment, which created a social crisis, both of those leaving the country, and then many of the parents in the country turned to alcohol and drugs because of the lack of opportunity. So prior to the war, there was a crisis of orphans, flooding a system, and a struggle to try to maintain care for those. And now you add 3 years of war where the systems that were struggling before barely exist.
Right.
And now we have hundreds of orphans flooding the system in Ukraine, sometimes on a monthly basis.
Let's talk a little bit more about the war in Ukraine. How has it affected your efforts? You're saying that essentially the social safety net, weak to begin with, not there?
Not there.
Mm-hmm.
But much of any social structure in Ukraine barely exists now because all of their efforts and energies are defending their country. So anything that existed prior to the war is a small semblance of what it was before the war, which was not much.
Let's talk about the origins of this ministry. How did Kingdom Bridges start for you?
Well, it started as a pastor of First Baptist Robertsdale in 2001. I took my first trip to Eastern Europe. And from that trip, I began to meet pastors and churches. And we went back year by year. And over 20 plus years, I developed relationships, and I would support their ministries and their work, equip them, encourage them, connect other churches and resources to them. And as that grew year by year, decade by decade, I realized that that was the call of my life and the direction of my life. And so I transitioned from being a pastor and missionary to just somewhat of a mission strategist, you would say.
Talk to me about that 2001 trip. What did you see and experience in Eastern Europe that you were not expecting?
It was one of my first trips outside of the Gulf Coast, period.
Wow.
So it was a pretty radical trip to go in 2001 to a little country called Moldova that still was steeped in communism.
Yeah.
And at that point, very underdeveloped, and so I kind of got immersed into a culture, but I found that the needs of people there was an openness to the gospel, to the Word of God, to the ministry of the church. I met great leaders. That was what was the biggest thing. I met such incredible, wonderful Christian leaders, pastors, church planners, orphanage directors, foster families. And so it just really birthed a desire for me to be more involved in. And every year since 2001, I've been deepening my involvement in Moldova and Ukraine.
Talk to me about the Kingdom Bridges. How do you guys work to coordinate with locals to keep kids safe? What does your work look like?
Well, the way we work is it's based on 20 plus years of relationships that I've been developing. So I know the pastors, I know the leaders, I know the foster families, the orphanage, and they trust me. And there's a high level of trust based on time. And so I've been working with them. So we come alongside them and empower them in their work. We help them do it better. We bring them financial resources. We bring them leadership resources. We bring them material resources. So we kind of fuel their work and work through them in those areas. And so it can look like what we call the PATH network in Moldova. We've created an organization of 10 international ministries working together to create a path for the most vulnerable at risk orphans who age out from 14 to 17. If those young people do not find a job, a career, and learn to stand on their own 2 feet, they're back where they started when an orphanage picked them up when they were 3, but even worse, because now they have targets on them. So we've changed our direction to really focus on job preparation, life skills, and we're actually working with their local business community to give them an internship to start a job, and we're putting staff in those jobs to give them aftercare so that we can get them on their feet. So we're not so much focused on housing, which we do, because everybody wants to focus house an orphan, house an orphan. But there's a clock ticking, and if they're not prepared educationally, if they're not prepared socially, if they're not prepared emotionally, spiritually, then when that clock, kind of rings for them, and in sometimes in the villages and the countryside, it'd be 14 years old. So a 14-year-old going into a very poor country where someone with a college degree has a hard time getting a job. A 14, 15, 16-year-old institutional orphan, that's where you get all those terrible statistics that are happening to those kids. So we've opened up with our partners a PATH network, and we're focusing on that, and we're getting a lot of traction. And we have 21 young people in that program right now that we just launched this year.
I'm glad you bring up that race against time, because I think a lot of times when we think of orphanages in our mind, we're thinking of little kids. We're thinking of like the Oliver Twist scenario. But you're really focused on getting teenagers job training. Talk to me about the kind of jobs that you can help train these teens for, so they can do something with their lives and don't get caught up in things that would make their lives poor.
What we try to do is do a market analysis of their community. And find the jobs that are uniquely tailored for them. Then we work with their business community to join us in developing a program that tailors the skill set so that when they finish that, they walk right into the job. So in that area, for instance, the Chisinau is the capital of Moldova. It's a city of 800,000 people. They have a robust restaurant industry. So food service, cleaning, and the basics of running a restaurant is very important. There's also hotels, and it's a big Eastern European center, so there's a lot of hotels, and we're learning. So we're working with those to try to create programs that uniquely prepare those young people for the specific jobs that are available to them, which is very niche and very limited in that part of the world.
Talk to me about Moldova. I feel like I'm like a lot of people in the West, where I know of Moldova, I don't know about Moldova. So why that country first?
Well, for me, it was just a call to go on a mission trip that turned into a lifelong partnership that I've been working specifically in that country deeply for many years. But it's a small country, about the size of Maine, population of about 4 million people, the state of Alabama. 25% of the population's out every day working. Outside in Europe, trying to get money back to their families. The country's very poor. It's torn between 2 worlds. The West, and just like Ukraine, the same battle there. There's the pull of the European Union and Western styles that they want, but then there's also a large component of Russia, and there is this battle that rages politically. It's in the news all the time. Elections where pro-Russian party, pro-Western parties, these elections are getting closer, and so there is this historical tension and pull that's been there since the fall of communism.
Does that affect your work?
Yes, everything we do. I mean, I have preached in settings where I have 2 different translations going on, one in Russian, one in Romanian, and then I'm doing English, and then there's a social tension between those 2 groups of people that we deal with all the time, that can run deep, because this is also, things happen where people have lost their lives. And in Ukraine now, it is every day.
You've got people dying every day.
Dying every day.
So you mentioned back when you visited in 2001 that it was still steeped in communism, and that brings up the idea that when these republics left the Soviet Union, it's not like democracy filled the void.
No.
They sometimes have a reputation for these former Soviet republics to be less stable governments than we're used to in the West. You talked about navigating the situation between pro-Russian parties and pro-Western parties. How do you navigate a tricky political situation where instability is also a factor?
Yeah, for most people, they want to have a quality of life.
Yeah.
And they're not as concerned as the ideologies that we think they are. They've been between ideologies for most of their life, but they want a quality of life. And so they typically will flow to where they feel the best quality of life is. In our work, we also don't focus on the ideologies, but the gospel. Our work is a Christian evangelical gospel ministry, and so we work in Russian settings where we speak Russian language and meet with people who identify in that political persuasion, and we do with Western, and in all groups we minister medical care to orphans, and we have churches and different ministries in all those environments. And so what keeps us focused is the gospel, and that's the focus of our work.
This all sounds very challenging. What do you think has been the most rewarding part of all this?
The most rewarding part is what we call, what the kind of tagline of our ministry is, heaven touching earth. You know, Jesus said in the Lord's Prayer that all of our faith traditions pray a great deal. There's in the middle of that, there's that verse that says, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We believe that Jesus wants us to manifest his kingdom in real, tangible ways on earth.
Yeah.
And so when we see the PATH network opening and 21 kids moving towards independence, that's heaven touching earth. We provided 4,000 elderly people in Moldova with medical care they would have never got, with updated medical machines that can save their life. That's heaven touching earth. In Ukraine, in the war, our churches, we have 30 churches in our network. They provide heating and cooling and food and shelter and clothing. In some months of the height of the war, we've had 50,000 people in those churches.
Yeah.
That's heaven touching earth. So what motivates my heart is when we see tangible ways that heaven touches earth.
Pastor Jeff Copeland with Kingdom Bridges, we thank you for joining us for Faith Time.